Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension. Self.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to a podcast not only of sound but also of mind. It's Time to Rewind is a podcast that takes a journey into a wondrous land of time loops whose boundaries are that of imagination. I'm your host, Bubbawheat, and each episode my guest and I explore these time loops one loop at a time. This stop is Trapped in the Twilight Zone, and this is the 13th stop at 2020's Season 2, Episode 9, Try, starting at 26 minutes and 55 seconds, with Mark telling Claudia it's all been about getting this right before telling her he loves her, and ends at 39 minutes and 41 seconds, with Mark getting dragged away by two security guards with a bloody nose. Here with me is my guest Lisa Leheey from the Siblist and Between the Scares. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be here to talk about this today.
Yeah, I'm excited to finish this episode here with these last two episodes with you. It's been a lot of fun really digging into this episode. It's a lot better than I was expecting to be, and so far it's really held up to repeated viewings and to dissecting it in this way. But
For sure, yeah.
But let me ask you, was this the first time that you watched this episode?
It is, yes. I had started watching Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone episodes when they first released, and I can't pin down what exactly... there really isn't a cause for me not to have watched them all the way through. I guess it was a matter of, I'm going to save these and come back to them, and just never did for whatever reason, because I really do enjoy what he's done with the show. So I liked getting to see this for the first time in preparation for talking with you.
Yeah, I think I have pretty much the exact same experience. I started watching the entire first season, I think right around whenever the second season came out, because we got Paramount Plus for a handful of months, and then we started watching the season 2 episodes, and for some reason we only made it like 2 episodes in, and then we didn't finish the back half. So I didn't catch this one either until doing it for this podcast.
Oh, cool.
So what did you think about the episode as a whole?
I really enjoyed it. You go into a Twilight Zone episode looking for the kicker, and, of course, every episode is going to have something to it. So you go in and you look at that, but at the same time, I really enjoy the character development. I really enjoyed the casting choices. You have Topher Grace as this sort of friendly kind of guy that, sort of come onto the scene with that 70s show. And I don't want to say he's goofy, but he's not a threat. He's just not that threatening kind of character. And then in this episode, you have those moments where he does just sort of flick a switch, and you really get to see his talent as an actor. I really liked Kylie Bunbury a lot, too. I'm not as familiar with her work, but she struck me very much with this in her subtlety and her engagement with this stranger. And so as an English teacher and as somebody who has just always loved stories, I liked watching how this particular episode came together, where the small switches are in alignment, let's say. Yeah. I like how you start off with one character, then you switch to another as far as allegiance goes, and then you kind of go back again. And it takes a certain kind of craft to be able to do that, one, so subtly, two, so well. Because if you don't notice it, it means that they've really woven that into the story well. So I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned that his character more or less flips a switch. And I think that there is like kind of a bit of a slow process if you're paying attention. And then I think in in this section specifically that we're talking about today is pretty much where he really flips that switch and becomes full-on villain.
Right.
I have been asking people, do you remember when you started to get the idea that Mark was not a nice guy as he claimed to be? Like when did you start getting the creepy vibes from him? Because the episode does start in like kind of a meet cute romantic comedy sort of way, and then it just slowly and subtly gets darker and darker as the episode goes on.
I think it was probably around when everything was aligned so carefully to her childhood fantasies from the Museum of Natural History. That's where I started going, okay, here's the kicker. I was noticing the watch alarm, but I couldn't place what it was. At first, I didn't even think it was his. I thought it was just something in the area. In fact, when it first happened, I think it was with the water bottle was the first time. I remember distinctly, like, wait a second, because that's nobody in my house with a watch like that. And I'm like, wait, did I hear a watch alarm? And I, hit the rewind button for a moment just to hear that again and then see the alignment with the water bottle. And I was like, okay, so that's a thing. As far as knowing why he was more villainous or more creepy, that didn't come till later. But the alignment with everything that fits so well with her, that raised my alarms. I was like, okay, there's something going on there. So also, just as a quick little random side note, the fact that my brother's name is Mark with a C, I had quite the hearty laugh when she talked about that story from 7th grade where the C made it sexy. And I was like, oh, that's going to be some great ribbing later. I know that's not my part of the episode, but I had to make sure I threw a shout out to my brother for that one.
Well, we do get a callback to it in this section.
It's true. That's true. I just thought that was wonderfully entertaining as well. But it was right around when every single thing he said was too perfect. And I was like, this is the Twilight Zone. See, like, I almost kind of wish I didn't know it was a Twilight Zone episode, because I feel like going into that show, your radar is up. And it's almost like the impact isn't as strong as it could be. I really love a good trick. I love a great unreliable narrator. But when you go in knowing that you've got a kicker, when you go in knowing there's an unreliable narrator, you're watching for it. And I much prefer sitting back and being surprised by things. I don't know. I could end up going in circles myself with this because I do love the Twilight Zone. But I almost wish that this could have been so much more unnerving had I not known it was a Twilight Zone episode, if that makes sense. I've gone so far off your question, it's silly at this point.
No, that's quite all right. I think that ties into like the general thought of spoiler culture and being surprised, and I've always been, or not always, but for a long time I've always been of the mind where I don't care about spoilers, and I feel like
you and I are not going to get along well.
And I feel like being spoiled on a story actually enhances it. But at the same time, like, I'm not the person, like, I don't actively spoil things for people, and I don't actively seek out spoilers for myself. But if like a big twist gets spoiled for me, I'm past the point where, like, I don't get upset. I'm just like, oh, I get to the point where I look forward to see how that twist or how that surprise reveals itself.
That's so interesting.
And I always come back to this study that I read about years ago, where they tracked people's enjoyment of a story, and they compared their enjoyment for people who have not been spoiled by a twist ending, or I think it was like a murder mystery book, and half the people they told who was the killer at the end, like the reveal at the end, and then half of them went in blind. And the people that knew the ending ahead of time actually scored higher overall enjoyment of the story than those that didn't know.
That's really interesting. Like, I want to subject myself to that study because it's certainly no secret, and I feel people are sick of hearing it, but maybe your listeners aren't familiar with my carrying on, but I gave up watching movie trailers a good, it could be almost 3 or 4 years now, at all. I used to just do it for movies that I was really interested in seeing, like something specific, like, for example, Ghostbusters Afterlife. That was a torment for me because my favorite movie is Ghostbusters, and this stupid thing being delayed so long, I was on blackout for 2.5 years, where the only thing I saw was that teaser trailer with Ecto-1 in the barn.
Yeah.
And the only things I knew going into this movie were that Finn Wolfhard was in it, and there were kids involved, and it was probably going to be a torch passing thing, which I hate, but that's a conversation for another day. And that Paul Rudd was in it, and that there were mini Stay Puffs. And I was like, I don't even want to know Paul Rudd is in it, but I'll live. That's all I knew. And just seeing movies unfold, I'm a horror fan too, especially, so everything is in those trailers. This summer, for example, The Forever Purge and Escape Room 2. Escape Room 2 is really not a brilliant movie example, but you get my point.
Yeah.
The endings to both of those movies are in the trailer. And that study really would be fascinating me to read, I think, and to be a part of, because I think my enjoyment of movies has escalated simply because I'm seeing everything for the very first time when I sit down in the movie theater. I'm that weirdo who sits in my seat when the trailers are running before a movie, and I either distract myself with my phone or with like a book on my Kindle app, or I just kind of like look at IMDb. So I'll see like the beginning of a trailer, I'll get an actor I recognize, I look up the movie, and then I can put in my calendar when the movie comes out. I hear the trailer, but it doesn't stick because I'm a visual person.
Yeah.
The idea that people would enjoy something more, I get it. Because
whenever you think about it, the movies that you love are the ones that you've seen over and over again, and
sure,
and you enjoy it just as much, if not more, the 5th, 6th, 10th time that you've seen it, even though you know everything that's coming. It's almost like there's a
comfort to it.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around, too, where people who watch the same TV shows over and over again or the same movies or whatever, there's a comfort to it. I do see myself as an outlier to that because I don't tend to watch the same things over and over again. Like, I'll watch certain movies more than once. But I am so hungry for new stories and new ways of telling stories. I think I'm an outlier here because I'm just so fascinated in hearing something new. But I also don't want the same story dragged on forever. This is just so off track. I'm sorry. This is such an area that my life is focused around as an English teacher, as a book nerd, as a movie nerd. I love stories, and just when they come together and I'm tricked by them, I love being surprised that way. And it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, I won't shut up about it.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and bring it back to the actual episode.
I'm sorry.
And no, it's quite all right. I enjoy these tangents just as much as anybody else. But in terms of coming back to the start of this part of the episode, I want to say this loop, but it's not really this loop. It's just the continuation of this single loop after we just finished this montage. But he has this, it starts out with this I love you moment with him declaring his love. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this a couple times in previous episodes because this always reminds me of Groundhog Day, which I just spent a lot of time with whenever that's the end of Phil's first date with Rita, and this entire episode feels like basically Phil's last first date with Rita, and it goes wrong whenever he says I love you. And I think that this one goes wrong a little bit earlier than that, but that really exemplifies, how he's missing the point.
Absolutely. He's in this moment where he feels like he's in some sort of movie or TV show, and he's doing his grand romantic reveal, and he expects that she's going to just fall into his arms and everything's going to, be perfect, which is ironic because, he reveals that he's been doing this so many times. He should know that, things don't work the way you expect them to. There is no, I just love the irony of this story where he thinks that because he's doing it perfectly, it will go perfectly. But the fact that he's done it so often proves that it won't go perfectly.
And not only that, but he talks about, this time I'm doing everything the right way.
Yeah.
Being completely open with you. I think that we need to be connecting on a deeper level. And he even says,
it's her fault.
Yeah, which I'll get to that in just a minute. I definitely have notes
Sure.
on that. But he also says, very early in this section, he says, "We've been together many times." Do you think that that's a euphemism for sex?
Absolutely, without question.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that he hasn't really referred to that specifically earlier in the episode, but it's interesting that he has been able to turn her into a one night stand many times before this. But he feels like
I wonder about because is this day repeating, or because he says that he ends up back here whenever he dies. Is it whenever he goes to sleep as well?
Yeah, he that's what he says. He says every time that he goes to sleep, and he has like a little pause there, and he says dies. Okay,
that's what I glommed onto then.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if he had like years-long relationships with her in some of these tries. That was an impression I got where I was like, oh, okay, they are extending this a little bit. But no, I think you're right then, because that's a detail that I overlooked for whatever reason.
Yeah, and he mentions that he's well into 4 digits in repeating.
Yeah.
He talks about he's been through this single day at least over 1,000 times.
Ugh. I want to watch some of those boring ones where he doesn't care and he just like can't be bothered to try, because how do you keep the energy doing something that many times? I mean, like Groundhog Day, when he just is like going through the motions because he's just bored of it.
Yeah, and the like in the next sentence, he has this moment which I think is interesting, and I don't think it was something that ever happened really in Groundhog Day, but he mentions that she asked him why today keeps repeating, and she's like, well, I didn't ask you that. And
exactly.
And it's like he's mixing up his days in his mind. It's like, she's asked that in various other iterations of this day, but she didn't ask it specifically in this day. That he's gotten to the point where he can't keep it straight exactly what's happened in this specific day, because he's changed things so subtly each time that there's differences in conversations, that he may have heard her ask that question 30 or 40 different times, but she didn't specifically ask it this time, and so he gets mixed up, which is understandable. Yeah. But I love that that what happens, like you mentioned earlier, he immediately corrects her. He's like, no, you did ask me. And that's,
because he's convinced.
Yeah. And it's also like a perfect example of him being a mansplainer.
There it is. Yep. Definitely. And that comes into some of the casting choices, but I'll save that for later, I think.
This is, one of many examples that we'll see in this section, where he shows that he's really being selfish and he doesn't care about her opinion. He just thinks about himself, and he's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I'm right. My memory is correct. I remember you hearing that, and that definitely happened today.
Mm-hmm. And he's distinct in this. He's like, nope, I am certain because I've done it so many times. I know that I'm right. You are wrong. Absolutely.
Hmm. And then shortly after that, he says that he's being, quote, totally honest with her.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that he swallows there. So do you think that that's like a tell that he's not actually being totally honest with her in this moment?
Yes, definitely, because there's always something he's holding back. There's always something about um, whatever he knows or whatever he's planning or whatever the situation is that she will not know about. Um, so there's definitely something going on there. He says that, and I think people do say that as a means of trusting them. And that's exactly when you should not trust them, because if they're alerting you to the fact that they're being completely honest, there's definitely something you don't know. Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, because I'm curious. I did bring this up with somebody else. Do you think this is the first time that he's quote unquote told her the truth about him repeating this day?
No, I don't. I just don't, because if after that many times, you would have tried to quote unquote be honest at some point sooner. Otherwise, that really says a lot about him as an individual, because if he waited into the 4 digits to be completely honest with her, then what the hell's he been doing up to this point?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the line that I always come back there that I've uh, latched onto and to support my argument is during the big, my favorite scene is the big 360 degree camera movement whenever he's like going through all the stuff that he knows about her and the
Mm-hmm.
sneezing and talking to the guy about his nephew. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and after that, he's like, I knew you wouldn't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
And like that
Yeah.
right there, it's like, yeah, he knew that he wouldn't believe her because he's told her before.
There's that, and see, I love that line because it's got so many layers to it. You're right. He knows because he's told her before, but there's also the fact that we know that inherently with certain people because we know that it may sound strange or it may sound crazy or it may sound whatever. Um, you know, I'd like to think that you haven't been caught any time loops lately, and I know I haven't. But we've certainly have said that to people where I knew you wouldn't believe me, where you say you knew, but you actually don't. You're assuming. So there's a great layer to the language in this particular episode because he literally does know, whereas the rest of us figuratively know, even though it's a very common phrase that we all use.
Yeah. And I think that leads into the next moment in this scene where she starts to try to reach out to two other museum patrons for help, and they're both wearing
Mm-hmm.
headphones so they don't hear her, they don't pay attention to her, and he basically manipulates her into staying, claiming that he knows that she doesn't have her in her and that she's not going to make a scene. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that is really a very telling situation, and it's something that I unfortunately I think a lot of women would be familiar with.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with you on that. It's just interesting to think about why people stick around in situations where they are so uncomfortable. It's something she says, like, I am not comfortable. I am not at all comfortable with this situation. And yet she stays there. But, you end up in these two situations because you go to the whole horror trope of, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? The quote unquote stupid girl who goes up the stairs instead of out the front door. You have that great Geico commercial where you have the group of people and they're like, let's hide behind the chainsaws. And the girl's like, why don't we get into the running car? Like this idea of why we do things where sometimes there isn't much rationale for it. You argue she could try and walk away. She could chase after that couple. he is going to come after her, whether violently or not. He is going to follow her, because why wouldn't he? I think where they are is especially interesting. They're in that sort of maze of masks and wall displays, and there doesn't appear to be a guard in that space. Now, you look at this and say, okay, go ahead.
And I talked with the director of this episode, and one thing that she mentioned that she specifically did is throughout the entire episode, anytime you see them like changing levels, they're always walking down. And so it's like they're going farther and down into the bowels of this museum, to where, you know, that limits her method of escape. And, you know, you could theoretically be, you know, she's on they're on like the fourth basement level, and it's likely, you know, this is not necessarily a popular part of the museum, so they could very conceivably be the only two people on that floor. I mean, we know that the two people with headphones, but they seem like they were, you know, going away. They're probably going back up to a different section.
Right. They essentially walk past a doorway. They don't even come into that room. And so it is this interesting way of isolating them and confusing them, because if she were to take off, if she didn't go right out that door, which, you know, horror films, she's not going to, but this idea that she would get lost, that she would get turned around, I almost feel like she's looking at this situation saying, okay, could I make a scene? What are they really going to do? Where is she going to go? I think there's a feeling of helplessness there. And I think that also happens in life, where you feel uncomfortable. I know you're not going to make a scene. The social normalcy of women's behavior, I think, sometimes comes up to either our own literal or perceived limitations. You know, I am not a fast person. So if I'm in an uncomfortable situation, I know that I'm not going to get too far running away. So I will start looking around at other options, you know, but that's me personally, who, for all I know, this girl, Claudia, runs marathons on weekends. So maybe she could, but she chooses not to. So I feel like there's an interesting layer of intellectuality, if that's a word, intellectualism, we'll see, where she's almost studying him because she kind of can't believe she's in this situation.
And I think at the same time, there's also always the element of the fear of victim blaming, where
definitely
there's always the fear of running for help, because there's that fear that the first response will be, well, why did you get yourself into that situation?
Yeah. Or you're just overreacting.
Yeah. And also, you know, you talked about her saying that she feels uncomfortable, and I think Mark has a line that is very relatable to people, because he immediately shifts that blame onto her. He says, there's not a romantic moments that you can't ruin, to where he doesn't take any responsibility for for making her feel uncomfortable. Instead, it's her that's ruining this romantic moment, not him making her feel uncomfortable.
Right. And it's you know, if you'll allow me a little bit of generalization, but it's every woman's dream to have this romantic moment where the music comes up and this great admittance of love. And he's saying to her, like, look, I'm giving you exactly what you want. She herself, in the first moments of meeting him, says into her little recorder, and, you know, meet with future husband. She did it herself, and I'm not blaming her here. But this is a common thing, I think, for a lot of people, let alone women, where we want that sort of romantic moment. My husband is currently studying for his theater groups, Jane Austen. You know, he's watching Pride and Prejudice yesterday at the end, and we're both sitting there watching this swelling moment of romance. And, you know, like, this is a very popular thing. She even thinks, oh, this random guy, you know, might be my future husband. And yeah, exactly what you said, a meet cute. And yet it's her fault that the romance is falling apart in this moment, because she's ruining it. He's like, look, I've constructed this perfect day and you've screwed it all up.
Yeah, and that ties into the next thing that he mentions, because that's where he admits that his real name is Mark with a K, and
Right.
he also refers to her 7th grade story as lame, and that really shows his true personality coming out, and that helps prove that this isn't really him making a true connection, that he used that story for manipulation. And Claudia even calls him out for it. It's like, do you not see how messed up that is? And
Yeah.
he's like, no, I like, he doesn't specifically say it, but no, he absolutely does not see how messed up that is.
Nope, not even a little bit, because he's giving her everything she wanted. I got to tell you, when he was, when he so carefully fit his name into her silly story, I didn't think his name was Mark at all. I figured his name was something else entirely, and he had just taken on that particular name. So I thought it was interesting that it turned out his name did actually turn out to be Mark with a K, which I don't entirely believe either, to be fair.
Well, I think it's interesting, and it fits with a lot of the other things that he does. I'm going to refer back to like the whole name montage where he comes up with the different names for the mask. Because
yes.
all those names are so similar to each other. It's not like he tries a different joke. He just tries changing the joke by inches each time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not Bob Thompson, it's Bob Johnson.
Right, exactly.
So,
and I went to school with a John Johnson, by the way. So I got another laugh at that.
So I think I personally, I believe that his real name is Mark with a K, and he just made that subtle change, because I do think that these two people are almost a fit for each other, and if he was not being so selfish, they could potentially make this relationship work, because they do have a lot of honest things in common. I do think that whenever she talks about her favorite exhibit being in the Natural History Museum, being like the different Earth layers, and then he has that moment where he's like, "Oh, really? You're still surprising me." I feel like that moment was genuine, and that
I agree
really
with you on that.
was a connection that he didn't know about yet, that came out of this iteration. And so they do have these commonalities, and they do have these personalities, but he is so wrapped up in himself and in trying to escape this time loop that he's trapped in, and making these just subtle changes to himself, that he thinks that it's more like a puzzle. I mean, he even says specifically that it's like a puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And it's this interesting element where, even though he's gone into the 4 digits number of times that he's done this, that there are these little things and these little situations in which you can't necessarily predict what someone is going to do, no matter how many cheat sheets and beeping watches you have.
Yeah, and we do see some of the differences. The next thing that he brings up is Claudia says that Mark wants the freedom to do what he wants without being judged. And I think that is exactly what he is doing within this time loop. And I think that might even, hint upon the reason that he's trapped in this time loop, because he wants the freedom to do what he wants without being judged, because he can do whatever he wants, and he might be judged for, a few hours, but then the next day he's no longer judged.
Right. And who's he being judged by? It's just being judged by her, not being judged on a larger scale, because he never really caters to anyone else. In fact, he mocks other people throughout the whole thing. Like, he asks that individual how his nephew is feeling, and the guy's like, "Do I know you?" And he just kind of keeps going. Imagine what the rest of that guy's day was like. It's just this arbitrary moment, but, my brain immediately goes to, well, now I want to go know how that guy feels.
Yeah, and Claudia asks him to see the situation from her perspective. And yet again, yeah, he's like, "No, but think about what I'm going through." Like he doesn't
It's
even
all about
give
him.
he doesn't even give her a moment. It's just this immediate focus back on me, like camera back on me, camera back on me.
Yes. Yep. Back to me. Absolutely. It's all about him. It's all about his success because he's now so driven by winning that he's no longer thinking about her anymore.
Yeah, and he claims that he's changed for her, but he hasn't really changed at all.
No.
He just he changes details about his story, but it's not real change within himself.
No, not at all. I mean, that line he says, "This is all for you," is like, those are the words, back to the romantic trope that, people want to hear from their object of affection. Whereas at the same time in this episode, it's one of the creepiest lines, like it reminds me of Labyrinth and the character of the Goblin King, Jareth, played by David Bowie, where he says, I have moved everything for you. Like I moved the stars for no one. I do all of this for you and you still don't want me. And it's like, this is not love. This is creepy.
And the other line for Jareth, which I think fits in this situation, is like, if you do everything I ask, I will be your slave.
Yes. Yes. And it's creepy. I show that movie every now and then to my freshmen, and they're just like, what is happening here? It makes for some really interesting conversations, but I love the movie so much, I just have to make them into little 80s minions by my own, so...
Yeah, and there's yet another example, just of his selfishness, because there are so many packed into these 12 minutes. And she asks him, what do you think I'm missing in my life? And do you remember what he replies to that?
That she doesn't love him.
Well, he says that he knows that she's loved him, and that she's even said it once.
Yes, once. Like, oh God, I want to see that day. That's the other thing. Like, there are so many different layers here that I want to see the other ones, and of course you can't. But the imagination runs wild. But I found that to be such an interesting moment where she has sort of figured out how self-centered he is. And so now she's realizing she has to change tack, and she has to put the focus on her through his perspective. She knows that he's not going to look at it through her point of view. So she says, okay, so what is it that I'm not doing? And it's almost it's a mechanism where she can now do potentially whatever the thing is. And he gives her this impossible answer. And it's just like, nope, that ain't going to happen. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. And she also adds, just because I said it once, does that mean that you're entitled to it from then on?
Yeah, no backsies.
Uh-huh.
Which is a wonderfully juvenile phrase. It definitely throws you back into like middle school.
Yeah.
And the idea of everything being not fair, which is also a Labyrinth thing. This idea that everything has to be fair. But here he's not playing fair.
Yeah, he's using his knowledge of what's happened during all these previous days. That, he uses the phrase, which I didn't have subtitles, so I'm not even sure exactly what he's saying, but he's like the top tier of the universe.
Mm-hmm. When he's a god.
Yeah.
He says the puppa fucking tier of the universe, and I lost my mind. So first of all, I do watch it with captions. So that line came on. I said, that's the cheesiest thing I've ever seen, and I love it. Then it was the poor captioner who had to write that out. It was just like this amazing moment where it was like somebody laughed to themselves in front of their computer for a good 15 minutes and went, oh, I'm totally keeping this. Yeah, like that whole situation. I'm pretty much the puppa fucking tier of the universe. I've lived this day so many times. I did write that one down because that was a hell of a line. And, he says, it's not the first time I told you I love you, but it's the first time I did it right. Well, what does that mean? In whose perspective is this being done correctly? He says this is the right way, but clearly it's not.
Mm-hmm. And throughout this entire conversation, he still doesn't he doesn't see Claudia. Like, he doesn't see what he's doing to her and how she's acting. He's just like, he's kind of on autopilot almost.
Mm-hmm. It's like a video game, like if I say exactly the right thing, I'll move to the next level. I mean, she even says, if there are so many me's, right, to paraphrase, then I don't actually matter. And he goes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, and that's a moment when he kind of realizes, I could do whatever I want right now, and you're right, I'm just going to get another you tomorrow.
Well, see, I actually look at that a little bit differently because, she says that if she doesn't matter, it could justify anything. And the way that he says it couldn't it? Mm-hmm. He says it very flatly. He doesn't say, there's no like realization in his voice. It's not like, he doesn't say it, oh, it couldn't it?
I disagree.
I feel like he says it very coldly. I feel like he says it couldn't it? Like I got the feeling that he's saying it very matter-of-factly, and I read it that it implies that he's actually acted on that instinct before many times.
Oh, I think that's fascinating because I see it the opposite way, where it's like it couldn't it? And now I'm going to. Because he does later say that he's never done this part before. It's fun. He's playing. Where he's going to actually follow through on this. That's interesting because I do agree with your coldness adjective, where he says it could, but I think that something is dawning on him where I don't matter clicked with him in a certain way, because he did say he's never gotten this far before. I don't know if that means in the romantic moment, in this scenario, in general, whatever it is, because it doesn't seem like a long enough day for them to gotten intimate, but, maybe the canoe scene got somewhere. But this, it seems like here's where something clicked for him to me, where he's like, yeah, you're right, you don't matter, because I am just going to get another one of you. And that's how I saw it. But I like your perspective, too. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and then it gets, I think this is kind of the darkest moment of this episode, where he says, we don't have to waste the rest of this try.
Oh, yeah, that's a chilling line.
And then she swears at him, and he's like, yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind. So
I hate that line. I'm like, oh, that was a cheap shot. Get on with it.
But it really strongly implies that at this point, he definitely has the intention to sexually assault her.
Uh-huh. Yep, I agree with you.
But it turns into the fight scene. And
yes.
What do you think that Claudia was thinking when she took his watch?
I think she was just grasping at straws. Because what are you going to do? Like, I think that's her thinking, I'm going to prevent you from knowing what happens next. Where on our side, being sort of an omniscient viewer, I guess that's arguable, where we know already that, he is going to be able to do whatever it is he's done because I feel like when you have this is what my brain does, forgive me, I come up with 14 different sentences at once. So when you have a conversation, you will not remember every last detail properly, especially when you've been hanging with someone all day and you have not yet been alerted to the fact that there's something wrong. So I think the fact that we know, and we have been studying this episode, and I don't just necessarily mean you and me, I mean any average viewer who knows this is the Twilight Zone episode and is paying careful attention to what's being said, we will retain more of the details. So we will hear from him that he's done this X number of times. We will know that he said, I've never gotten this far. She thinks that this watch is the key, so she's going to grab at it because she's got nothing else. I think that's a moment of desperation where she thinks it's a good idea and she acted on it immediately because it was like, oh, this is something I can do. Mm-hmm. And she did it. And I think the moment she had it, she kind of realized, like, this isn't really a thing.
Yeah, and I do love his line where he's like, oh no, you stole my magic watch.
Yes, like what a dick. Like he's being such a jerk about it.
And then we get to I think this is kind of my favorite part of the episode. And one other little detail that I noticed is, he grabs a mask and puts a mask on.
Oh,
And
that's hilarious.
and I think it's funny too that the mask that he chooses, the mouth, it's a weird mouth, and I feel like the mouth looks like an asshole, and I think that is it's very appropriate because it's like this round, like almost puckered starfish looking.
That's great.
And I think that is. I'd like to think that was intentional because, yeah, he's putting this on and that's like he's physically embodying the fact that he's an asshole.
Yes, I think that's fantastic.
And then, what did you think about how this loop ends up with her literally kicking his ass?
More than once, like
Yeah.
more than one punch. I find it interesting that he was yet again wait, where's my notes? Because I want to make sure I say it properly. If you land even one punch, I will personally give you, is about to say, I'm going to give you $1,000, and wham, like, well, that's not going to work. Wham again. She gets him 4 times and he's just on the ground. And I love that she did that. I love that she just acted on it. I mean, the adrenaline had to have been through the roof. And I like that he's incapacitated by it. Because he's a human being. He's not Michael Myers, who's just gonna like crick his neck and just keep coming at her,
Yeah,
So I thought that was good.
And he's like, a regular nerdy academic guy. He's somebody that's clearly never been in a fight before. He doesn't really know what to do, but he is filled with just this sense of self-importance that he's like. There's no way that I'm going to lose a fight to a girl.
Right. There's no way this girl is going to actually hit me.
Mm.
She's not going to make a scene. Why would she hit me? Absolutely.
And then
he makes fun of her when she said, "Oh, you sound super confident about that."
Yeah. And I just love the fact that this episode basically ends in a happy ending, at least from Claudia's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about it a bit more in the next episode. But I do think that it is not exactly a happy ending from Mark's point of view, but there is hope in the next scene. But I do just love just this, like, I mean, did you or did you not like just want to just have this audible cheer whenever she lands that first punch?
Oh, it's fantastic. You do kind of, it happens and you sort of go, oh, like you sort of react in that way anyhow, especially because it's such a solid hit. Mm-hmm. And then the more she keeps hitting it, you start wondering like, ugh, I consider myself fortunate that I've never been punched in the face. So I don't know what that nose crunch must feel like either for her or for him. You just look at that and go, ooh, that's gotta smart. That's gonna be pretty uncomfortable. And he's sort of like on the ground whimpering. I want to know where the guards come from. Like, they're like, oh, there he is, or whatever it is they say. And I'm like, is somebody watching on a security camera? Like, how did they know to come?
That was my impression, because he does have one line earlier in the episode where he's like, where he points out, the security camera right here is not working.
Yeah, okay.
So I do think that they have been watching this on the security camera, so that they see the escalation, and then it just took them that amount of time, because they probably saw it happening. Him
taking the mask.
Yeah, and that's probably what alerted them, and it took them that long to get those two guys actually to physically get all the way down to the bottom level of the museum.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. There's probably some sort of silent alarm that went off when he put on the mask and when he takes that sword thing off the display. So, yeah, that's
like
a good
the sawtooth sword.
Yeah, that thing was brutal looking. I'm like, ooh, that thing's either going to really hurt or it's going to crumble the second it hits her.
Yeah, I got the impression that it would just completely break as soon as he tried to use it.
Yup, which would have been kind of funny, but I guess that would have gotten a little violent. Like, I would have been entertained by him taking a swing and it just snapping in half.
Yeah, but I think that pretty much gets to the end of this section. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about that?
No, I don't think so. There really wasn't anything. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of things in this little piece.
Yeah, it's the dialogue is so well written, and there's so many things just packed into it that the more that I watch this episode and dig into it, the more I really enjoy it. And
Absolutely.
and honestly, I do think that of these 6 episodes of the Twilight Zone that I've really dug into, that this one is by far my favorite.
Yeah, it's a really solid episode.
Mm.
Excited that I got to talk with you about this one and about this part. I mean, it's like this is the cool chunk of it. You know, like it's great to talk about the beginning, but I got to talk about the end.
Yeah, and this, I think you're a great guest, because this really does feel like this is where it turns into a horror movie.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. Things do work out every now and then.
Yeah, and so I wanted to talk about another classic episode of the Twilight Zone, as digging into the Twilight Zone more. I've really enjoyed it, and digging into these new episodes, I wanted an excuse to look at more of the classic episodes.
Absolutely.
So the episode that I chose for this section is actually the very first Twilight Zone episode, Where is Everybody? And I chose this because I thought it was fitting, since there is we do see 4 other characters. We see 2 just pass by in the beginning, and then we get the 2 security guards at the end. But other than that, they are pretty much alone in this entire section. And
for sure.
And this first episode is about a man who finds himself in this completely abandoned town, and nobody's around, even though the town appears like they had all just left.
Mm-hmm.
And so he spends the episode just wandering around, trying to find anybody else, and a lot of times just missing them. Like, he goes to the ice cream shop, he starts talking to himself in the mirror after he makes himself a sundae. He tries making a phone call and gets the automated recorded message from the operator.
Mm-hmm. The police station with the cigar that's still lit and smoking.
Yeah. And then at the end, we find out that he has been on basically an isolation chamber as a test run for a space mission. It's like, this is how it would be if you were actually, it's like a simulation to test how he copes with the loneliness. And apparently this was all basically a waking dream that he had.
Right. This is where he finally cracked and couldn't take it anymore. After being there, what do they say? Like, IMDb takes that number of hours and clocks it out to about 20 days and 4.5 hours.
I didn't remember. I actually watched this one a couple weeks ago. This was the first of the classic episodes that I rewatched. And these have just been more brief conversations, so I haven't done a ton of research into what was happening. But yeah,
I got it covered.
So yeah, it's like a long space travel mission, and the one thing that I do remember that I thought was a little ridiculous, to be honest, is he's like at the end, he's like, the next time we do it for real. It's like, what's seriously that you got this result, and then you're like, yeah, this is fine. Next time it'll be better.
Yeah, we'll send them out. Well, we'll keep them out for less time. Like, that'll be the game. Oh, okay, this is the mark. All right, we'll make sure we don't do it any longer than this. I think it's an interesting episode to bring up, especially coming off the pandemic. And I say coming off the pandemic, but coming off a year where a lot of us had lockdown.
Yeah.
And it really did dig into the idea where people don't do well isolated. And people who had to sort of stay in their homes and not interact with people physically. And I think a lot of us some people did better than others. You know, those of us who are introverts probably did a little better than people who are extroverts. I know my husband struggled, where I was like, cool, I don't have to go anywhere. Great, let's go. But I think it's interesting to look at this, and, you know, you can be supplied food, you can be supplied oxygen, we can get the waste out, we can get the fresh air in. But when it comes to interacting with people, there's just that thing in human nature where we need to have some kind of communication back and forth. There needs to be a kind of connection. And I think tying it back to try is really interesting, because he's not authentically connecting. He's pushing her further away. He's isolating himself even more, but he thinks he's doing everything right. And you have these scientists trying this isolation tank out, thinking, okay, well, we've done all of the things we need to do, and yet it still doesn't work.
Yeah, and this also reminds me of studies that people have done more recently in terms of the U.S. prison system, because solitary confinement is becoming a more and more common method of not even just punishment, but just
torture.
Well, yeah, but it from the prison's perspective, it's like that's just the only option that they have. It's easier. Right. It's easier to deal with prisoners if you keep them in solitary confinement. And there's been studies. I don't remember if it was an episode of Adam Ruins Everything or Last Week Tonight, or both of them, where they talk about the long-lasting damage that solitary confinement actually does do to a prisoner that's being held in there for long term. And they do actually have these hallucination episodes that is not too far removed from what happens in this episode.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, if you watch, you speak of the Moon, I mean, go to Sam Rockwell in Moon. You know, like, you're dealing with somebody who really gets into a precarious situation, and what that will do to your mind. Your mind needs to be stimulated. And when there's really nothing around to stimulate it anymore, and no one around, it's going to go, cool, I'll just do this on my own. You know, and it's just going to go into these weird sorts of states where you are along for the ride.
Yeah. Well, I think that about covers it for this episode. We've talked a lot about these 12 minutes and the one episode of the classic Twilight Zone. But I'd like to thank you for joining me today.
I'm thrilled that I got to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And for anybody that hasn't heard you before, why don't you go ahead and let them know where they can find you online?
Yeah, so you can find my two podcasts if you just do a quick search. Anchor FM is a host site for the Siblist, and that's Siblist. But you can find us pretty much anywhere. Grab a podcatcher and check us out. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple, we're on Google. And that's where my brother and I randomize which film we're going to watch next off of 4 different lists. And 2 of those lists are our personal lists of doom, movies that either Mark or I have been avoiding for one reason or another. And they're not necessarily all bad movies. In fact, one of our more recent episodes was Schindler's List, which neither of us had seen. So I no longer have a embarrassing film nerd secret. I have finally seen Schindler's List. So that episode is out, and you can check that out if you're interested. We also watch some terrible movies. Our next episode is on Anchorman 2, heaven help me, which Mark enjoyed. I did not, but Mark enjoyed. So that's a fun episode. You can also catch me with Jason Soto on Between the Scares, and that's where we are working our way through Jason Blum and Blumhouse's every film that he has produced or his company has produced, we are watching. And thank God we're finally in the horror movies, because I really cannot handle his non-horror movies. And I'm also a frequent guest on the Lambcast, so you can catch me there too. So I'm going to be playing some Lamperty soon for the finals of the year, so I'm looking forward to that game.
Yeah, and you have me to thank for for pointing out the correct pronunciation of Blumhouse.
I love it. Yes. Thank you for that. Yes, Jason brought that up. I was like, I thought so, but I wasn't sure. I mean, he just needs to change his name to Bloom because it just sounds better.
Yeah, I was in the same boat as you guys. I always thought that it was Jason Blum and Blumhouse.
Yeah.
And then I forget what show, but I watch a lot of reality competition shows like Face Off and like special effects makeup competitions. And he was on one of those types of shows as a guest judge.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And
Well,
that's
thanks for the correction.
yeah. And then that seeing him on that show, it's like, oh, that's how he pronounces his name. I never knew that.
Nope. Well, we have since corrected it.
And as for me, I am Bubbawheat, and you can find me at Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights.com. You can find me on Twitter at Bubbawheat, and you can find this show, It's Time to Rewind, on Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. We also have a Facebook group, It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group, where you can join and discuss episodes as they come out, as well as help me plan for future seasons of this show and just have any sort of conversations about time loop movies and TV shows in general. And until next time, I will still be right here, trapped in the Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval. Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another dimension.
Self.
Light.
Submitted for your
Shadow.
approval.
Another Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Submitted for your approval.
The Twilight Zone.
Think about what you're saying.
Claudia, do you think there's anything that I haven't thought about?
If I'm not real, then I don't matter. That could justify anything.
It could, couldn't it?